In April of 1988, that means around Passover of the year 5749, the Rebbe came up with a very interesting statement that was really unprecedented. He hasn't done that before at all. The Jewish calendar has Hebrew letters to it, which correspond to the date of the year. For instance, this year is 5751. If we take him on the numerical values, it is referred to as Tov Shin Nun Aleph. A year ago was Tov Shin Nun. And the year that I'm talking about was Tov Shin Mem Tes. On Passover Tov Shin Mem Tes, which is 5,749 years of world creation, the Rebbe unprecedentedly suggested that in 6 months there will be a new year that we will be ushering in, and the year will be Tov Shin Nun. And the Rebbe pointed, unlike ever in the past, that Tov Shin Nun represents the acronym of Tehei Shnas Nisim. Translated into English means it shall be a year of miracles. People didn't understand why the Rebbe said it, but the Rebbe suggested it. And the funny thing about it is, if we can chronically take and record what has taken place during that period of time, we will see that it was a year of miracles. Beginning with Erev Rosh Hashanah, the eve of Rosh Hashanah that year. Let's not start far from home. The eve of Rosh Hashanah that year was when the famous earthquake in San Francisco took place. The world looked in amazement that San Francisco had earthquakes before, but this year there was a tremendous tragedy. The earthquake went real high on the Richter scale, and that there were about 260 some odd casualties, some of which were caught on the bridge and some of which were caught half hanging off the bridge. Casualties galore because it happened during rush hour and when the traffic was amazingly full on the streets. And the world said that in a day like today, we should have seen a lot less casualties. We should have been able to cope with it and deal with it a lot better. However, if you want to look at it with a sober perspective, I think we have to look at it the other way. If you take a look, Candlestick Park, which had a baseball game that evening, was filled with some 65,000 spectators that came to see the game. Candlestick Park was struck by the earthquake, struck to the extent that it was cracked. And all engineers and everyone around there suggested that a little bit more of a crack would have brought tremendous casualties. And what I say is, if we want to look in the sense of the miraculous side of all this, rather than looking that there were 261 casualties that actually took place, why not look of the fact that with one more move on Candlestick Park, there could have been 65,000 deaths in no time. And yet, their lives were spared miraculously. I think for a moment we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the distinction between miracle and nature? From the Jewish perspective, there is no distinction. Nature is also miraculous. Why do we call one thing miracle and one thing we call nature? A simple reason. Nature is something that happens on a daily basis. We know we can count on the fact that every morning the sun will rise. We know we can count on the fact that every evening the sun will set. We know we can count on the fact that we're going to wake up in the morning, hopefully, and that all day long we're going to breathe, and at night we will go to sleep. And the next day, the same thing will repeat itself. We call that nature. However, when something takes place that is out of the realm of nature, we call it miraculous. However, from the Jewish perspective, nature is referred to the word teva. Teva really means, in Hebrew, concealed. If you look in the prayers when we daven, we say, Tubu v'yamsu, that the Egyptians were thrown and became concealed under the waters of the Red Sea. Teva comes from the word concealed. Looking at it from that perspective, nature in essence really is miracles, but concealed in the form of nature. The only question is, does one see when the miracle occurs, or does one not recognize when the miracle occurs? And our sages do suggest many a times that ein bal hanes makir b'nisim. Many a times when a miracle occurs to a person, he looks at it and just goes through it in passing. He doesn't even recognize that it's a miracle. So there are certain miracles that one can recognize. They're blatant miracles. We see openly that a person seemingly was dead and all of a sudden he's alive. A guy got hit by a car and naturally he couldn't have survived and he survives. We will call it miracle. Then there are other miracles that we have to put our eyes to it, such as the one I just suggested of Candlestick Park. We don't look at it necessarily as a miracle because, after all, the earthquake didn't hit there. But the fact that the earthquake may not have hit there because God intended not to kill 65,000 people is a miracle. So that too becomes a miracle. Then as the year progressed, came along a new phenomenon in the world, something that in the 5,000 years of world history that we know of never occurred before. Poland decided it was going from communism to democracy. Encouraged by whom? Encouraged by the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was recommending to the Polish leadership that they should accept upon themselves democracy. And it went through quite smooth. A little while later, we saw that Romania decided to go the route of democracy. A little while later, we saw that the wall in Germany came to a collapse and the unification of the two Germanys, where democracy again in East Germany collapsed. As time moved on, the Soviet Union decided that they were going to introduce glasnost and perestroika to the extent that they were going to go democracy. If one would sit for a moment and think to himself, where have we seen in history where revolutions of this magnitude took place bloodlessly, you will see that this too is miraculous. It just doesn't occur by sheer coincidence. It's miraculous that such kind of a turn from the left to the right, such kind of a drastic movement should take place in the world, and there shouldn't be some kind of a massive murderous revolution where thousands and thousands of people would lose their lives. And truthfully speaking, even in China, where there were deaths, by comparison to what could have taken place in terms of mass murders, it was a farce in terms of what actually transpired there. So if you look at these events just as major events, things that affected the world at large, 1990, which is the year of 5750, or as said to you before in the Hebrew numerical value, the acronym of Tehei Shnas Nisim, it was a year of miracles. I can probably go on and on and on in pointing out a multitude of miracles that took place, but let's suffice it to stay with these as just to point out the fact that the year 5750 was a year of miracles. Once again, unprecedentedly, last year in April, that means last year Passover time, the Rebbe looked forward to the calendar again and said, next year, which is in 6 months from now, we're going to be ushering in a new year, the year 5751. This time the Rebbe suggested that the numerical value, the acronym, the Hebrew acronym for the words 5751 will be Tehei Shnas Aren Niflos. It shall be a year of wonders, not just wonders, but wonders that one can see with his own eyes. Interestingly enough is that when the Almighty took the Jewish people out of Egypt, the Torah tells us that he had showed us a multitude of miracles. But then it says in our scriptures, that just like in the days that when God took the Jewish people out of Egypt, I will show you that when the coming of Moshiach will happen, there will be a repeat. There will be miracles as was there, but even more so. What is the distinction between miracle and wonders? The distinction is that a wonder is even wondrous in the realm of miracle. In other words, even in the realm of miracle, this is a miracle. But when the posik, the verse in the scriptures, uses the terms that when the Moshiach will show up, will be not only miracles as they were during the time of the redemption of Egypt, but it will be like in the days when I liberated you from Egypt. There will be wonders that will be seen with the eyes of flesh and blood by each and every person. Again, if we want to record chronologically what has taken place this year, we see those wonders effectively almost step by step. On August the 2nd, Saddam Hussein went and swallowed tiny Kuwait in his own little rights. And the world reacted. The world reacted with threats. The world reacted that if he doesn't move out of there, there will be sanctions. The world came together in a unified form and reacted. Responded to it. Ultimately, we know that there was definitely miraculous events that took place, especially beginning with January the 16th, through the time when the ceasefire came into effect. The world was expecting thousands upon thousands of casualties. The threats from Saddam Hussein was that hundreds of thousands of young men and women will be brought back in body bags into the United States. And these things were happening day after day when all these things were happening. And in essence, if we take now and we reconcile the total number of figures of what really took place from the moment that it occurred until after, so to speak, the ceasefire happened, we were talking a total of all the forces in the world that joined, which was 28 nations. We're talking about a few hundred casualties in all, and that includes people that were killed, and that includes people that actually were wounded on the battlefield as well. But in essence, there were less than 100 casualties of the American forces in total. If we would like to analyze this for a moment, we see that this is not just miracles, but this is wonders too. Let's analyze it for a second. The world is in a state of joltation, if you will. It's interesting that the Rebbe in the last few years, the last 5-7 years, has basically been speaking of words which, again, to us lay people seem to have been a little bit wild. The Rebbe used terms that the world is trembling, the world is shaking, the world is not acting its normal self. And if one wanted to be open-minded about it, you saw that this is not just words that somebody is trying to very nicely throw around and poetically use to impress and to impact somebody, but in essence, the world really was shaking. Things that were accepted over the years, today was not accepted. People that apathetically took things for granted today started using languages with spiritual terminologies. If you look through the entire period of the world, the entire armed forces of the United States or any coalition member was using terms of, wow, there were miracles. This is phenomenal. This is fantastic. The hand of God, and so on and so forth. The world began to use language that we were not used to hearing. Also, we see that not only in the Jewish world, but even in the world around us, there's definitely been a joltation of people who have begun to move towards spirituality. People have become fed up with the physical existence, with the getting up in the morning and going to sleep at night, and at the end of time, so to speak, when they're ready to pass out and to die, that so to speak, the record stops playing. They all came to a conclusion that there's got to be something more to life than what meets the eye. Maybe they did not find the proper terms on how to express it, but there was definitely that kind of a feeling that there's spiritual needs in the world. The Congress and the Senate over these last several years were dealing with issues of spiritual nature. They were dealing with issues of education. They were dealing with issues of whether or not to have a prayer in the public school system. They were dealing with issues that were more in spiritual nature than was ever in the past. The world at large was definitely affected by something which, for the lack of better words, had to be used, that there was a shaking, an awakening within the world of some kind of a spiritual rejuvenation. What does this all mean to us? So if we would like to sit back and analyze this, we would see that the Midrash tells us that the world in its present format would exist for approximately a 6,000-year period. 6,000 does not mean that we have to hit the 6,000th year, but 6,000 means the moment you concluded 5,000, you automatically entered your 6,000-year era. Just like when a person hits his 40th birthday, he's technically 41 years old already. It's just that he did not complete the 41 years, but he's already in his 41st year. The same thing the Medrash tells us, that the world will exist in a 6,000-year period. The first 2,000 years the Medrash refers to as Alpayim Shnei Alofim Toyu. That will be the world that is still unstable. The world is settling down, if you will. Then there will be Alpayim, or Shnei Alofim Shona, 2,000 years of Torah. The Torah was given on the Jewish calendar in the year 2048. It was given in the second 1,000 year. And then will be Alpayim, the last 2,000 of Yemei HaMashiach, the years of the righteous Messiah. So we're living in the period of time that is referred to as the years of Mashiach. What does that mean? Is Mashiach a real thing? Is this something that's just that we imagine and we hope and we strive for, or is this something that's real? In order for us to answer all this, let us first suggest, what do our Jewish books have to say about Mashiach? Who is this Mashiach? What kind of an individual will this be? Is this an angel that's going to descend from heaven and respond to the needs of the community? Or is this the whole thing nothing more than a beautiful phantom fantasy that we will have in our minds that one day the world will be a world of bliss? And then the question becomes, if Mashiach is real, what really happens in the world when he does come? Will we all of a sudden see money growing on trees? Will we all of a sudden see a total change in the world? Or will the world exist as it is in its present format, but there will be different needs, different callings, if you will, which we don't see today? Let's analyze it for a moment. 2,000 years ago, after the destruction of the temple, the Talmud tells us that two great sages walked by the place of the destruction on the Temple Mount. One began to cry, and the other began to laugh. And the Talmud says that the one that began to cry turned to the one that began to laugh and said, "Look, I'm crying because I'm mourning the destruction of the temple. If the temple is considered the house of the Lord in this physical universe, it was destroyed. Then there is a mourning period. I'm crying because we lost our house. The Lord lost his house in this world. I'm crying. But what are you laughing? What are you so jubilant about? What are you so happy about?" And the other sage responded to him and said, "I'll tell you why." He says, in the prophecies of the past, God Almighty tells the Jewish people that there will come a time that the temple will be destroyed because of our lack of proper behavior. But in the same breath and in the same prophecy, God lets the Jewish people know that he will rebuild the temple and he will send the righteous Messiah to do so. And at that point, we will enter an era in the world that there will be no more death, peace and tranquility will reign, and the world will be something different that we have never seen. So he says, until the destruction of the temple, one could have said to himself that the whole thing is a beautiful thought. However, now that the destruction of the temple took place, which means that the first half of the prophecy took place, he says, now I have nothing better to look forward to than the fulfillment of the second half of the prophecy. If God fulfilled the first half, he surely will fulfill the second. If that is the case, he says, I'm jubilant. Why am I so jubilant, he says? Because the very same Torah tells us that the moment that the destruction of the temple took place, that very day, Mashiach was born. B'yoyim shechorav beis hamikdosh noilad Moshiach shel Yisrael. The moment that the destruction of the temple took place, Mashiach was born. Which means that every day a Jew can and should await the coming of the righteous Mashiach. Who is this fellow? What is this fellow? Now, if you look around, many people in many communities and in many texts of the Siddur suggest and say this on a daily basis. And as a matter of fact, this is one of the 13 principles of faith that Maimonides spells out that a Jew must believe in, and that is the coming of the righteous Mashiach. And many people say it every day in the Siddur after davening, Ani ma'amin be'emuna shalema. I believe with a full faith with my whole heart, bevias HaMashiach, and the coming of the righteous Mashiach. And we suggest and we say, Af al pi she'yismameya, although that it's been already so long, it's almost 2,000 years now, and he hasn't come yet, one would think that you can lose your faith and your belief that it'll ever happen again. After all, sooner or later you'll lose, it fades away. Im kol zeh, despite all this, I still look forward to him every day for his coming. Let's be real. How many people on the street are looking forward every day, despite the fact that they say it in the Siddur, look forward every day for the real coming of Mashiach? Now, there are various statements in the Talmud and in various different Jewish books that suggest that there are certain times that are more ripe than others for the coming of Mashiach. The Talmud, for instance, says, Ein ben David ba, that Mashiach will not come only in a generation that is either completely righteous or, God forbid, completely wicked. A statement in the Talmud. The Talmud also suggests that there were various different times that was righteous for Mashiach to show up. We see throughout the ages and history that many of the Jewish community have felt on certain individuals who lived in their generation that they were Mashiach. And with spelled out names, some of which turned out to be nothing, some of which got killed in battle, some of which perhaps didn't accept it upon themselves. But the community at large believed that this person could have been Mashiach and potentially was Mashiach, but the time wasn't ripe and therefore it didn't happen. Which means that in the 2,000 years that we are talking about, that the Medrash relates to us, the Shnei Alofim Mashiach, the 2,000 years which is ripe at any given time for the appearance, for the coming of Mashiach, it can happen any time, but as we said before, there are certain times that are more ripe than others. The prophecies that we have throughout the ages, both in the scriptures and in midrashic sayings and wherever else it may be, also gives us certain occurrences in the world that are going to take place prior to the coming of Mashiach. I'm sure you've all heard in the world the expressions that prior to the coming of Mashiach has to be the famous world war, so to speak, of Gog and Magog. I'm sure you've heard different things that are supposed to take place in the world. But one thing all of us are going to have to admit, that throughout the ages we've seen it all. With the Holocaust, with World War I, with World War II, where the Jewish community per se was definitely affected to the extent that it was, we must all as Jews believe that all the prerequisites of events in the world that are supposed to take place prior to the arrival of Mashiach have already taken place in essence. What is left today is the physical arrival of this Mashiach, whoever it may be. What makes this year perhaps even more so ripe to this event is something very interesting. There is a medrash, which is referred to as a Yalkut Shimoni. something printed many, many years ago. And then there is a Zohar, and I will try to give you the synopsis of both of them. The Medrash and the Zohar both say similar things. One goes in a little bit more graphic than the other. The Yalkut Shimoni says that in the year when Moshiach will appear, the year that Moshiach will come, something interesting will take place. He says that the king of Aram, of Babylonia, or today of Iraq, will swallow a small Arab country. This will anger the world around them and will draw the entire world into battle. That's what he writes. And after all this takes place, the Jews will also be affected by it all. Affected to the extent that the Jews will become extremely nervous. The Jews will start asking themselves, where do we turn for help? Where are our friends in the world? Where are the people that can be of help to us? We're going to be at a total loss. At which point the Yalkut Shimoni says that Mashiach will appear on the roof of the Beis Hamikdash and say, don't be nervous, don't get excited. Everything that's occurring in the world today is being done strictly for you. And this time, different than ever before. This time you're approaching the final redemption in which there will never be an exile. After this, unlike the original redemption of the time of Egypt, where we had exiles after that, we are now approaching the moment of time in life when we will have the final redemption and never to see an exile again. And eventually Mashiach will build the Beis Hamikdash, and we will finally enter the time of the coming of Mashiach. This is something that the Yalkut Shimoni writes, seemingly very general, but seems to be speaking of something that has occurred just recently in our own time. The Zohar goes a step further. The Zohar tells of the same story, but the Zohar says the following. The Zohar asks a question and says, how come the children of Yishmael, the Arabs, don't have any zechus, any merits on the land of Israel? And the Zohar, the Zohar, and a lot of times the Talmud, when it discusses matters, it discusses it rhetorically, question and answer, give and take. So here too, when he wanted to bring out a point, it comes in the form of question and answer. How come not? The answer is because God made a covenant with the Jewish people, with Abraham, that he's going to give to the children of Isaac the entire land. But then the Zohar asks a question. The covenant was what? The covenant of circumcision. Yishmael also circumcised. And the Zohar responds to that and says, you're right. Because of the fact that he also circumcised, he does have some kind of a rights on the land of Israel. And the Zohar suggests that since his circumcision did not take place as prescribed to 8 days, he was already 13 years old, which, by the way, is still a tradition in all Muslim countries, that their children get circumcised at the age of 13 until today. Since he did not follow the prescription of circumcision as the Almighty had told him, therefore his merits, his rights on the land of Israel is shaky. And he writes the following, that there will be a time that Jews will be expelled from Israel, which was after the destruction of the temple. Then there will be a time that the Jews will re-enter Israel, but they will not be running the country yet. It will still be shared between them and the children of Yishmael, the Arabs. Then there will be an ups and downs during that period of time, going forth and back. This one has it, the other one has it, and forth and back. And then he says will come a time when the king of Bavel will bring the world into a rage and into a war, and the largest country of the world from a very far distance will get drawn into this war, and the whole many nations of the world will get drawn into this war, and the war will be not for long, a maximum of about 3 months. Exactly, these are the words that he writes, that it will only be approximately a 3-month war. And during this period of time, he says that the king of Bavel, namely Saddam Hussein, if we want to use the terms very blatantly, will throw deadly weapons at Israel. Obviously, he didn't call it scuds, but said he will throw deadly weapons at Israel. And I'm quoting the Zohar. Some of them will land on ground. Some of them will land in the ocean. Some of them will land near Jerusalem. And then Moshiach will finally come. I think it's a little bit more graphic than the Medrash that we learned a moment ago, but the idea is the same. Let's look for another couple of books of ancient history that prophesizes what's going to take place at the time of the coming of Mashiach. There's another very interesting medrash that says that in this war of Aram or Bavel, Iraq, if you will, and Kuwait, there will be such bombs, such deadly weapons that are going to be smarter than people. Those are the words used. Remember, these things are written hundreds, if not thousands of more years ago. They will be smart as people. Well, we used some bombs in this war that were called smart bombs, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Those bombs, if we recall correctly, especially everybody watched this war on the screen, had seen that these bombs were smart enough to make it through a door or through a window and hit exactly the target where it had to. So when the Medrash or the Zohar of what's going to take place during this war, including deadly weapons that will be as smart as people, we have already seen that as well. Now there is another book that is called Netzach Yisrael, a book that is called The Eternity of the Jewish People, written by the Maharal of Prague. That is the same individual who created the golem, who created the dummy that saved the Jewish community in many occasions from blood libels and other problems that took place. This individual was a great sage and a great scholar in the Jewish community, lived a few hundred years ago. And he has this book, which is totally dedicated to the subject of Mashiach. And one of his verses and chapters, he writes something very interesting. That being that the redemption at the time of Mashiach is supposed to be a replica, but on a larger scale, multiplied manyfold, as what took place during the redemption of the Jewish people from Egypt. Therefore, he says he is predicting the following to take place. That just like then, the reign of Moses had to be 40 years before the completion of the redemption, because after all, although the Jews left Egypt on the 15th of Nisan in the year 2048, they were not really totally free. As we ourselves see when we celebrate Passover. When we celebrate Passover, the first night of Pesach, we have a Seder. What are we celebrating? The night the Jews left Egypt. On the 7th day of Passover, what are we celebrating? The day the Jews crossed the Red Sea. And we are told that the reason we celebrate that is because, in essence, between the time that the Jews left Egypt until the time they actually crossed the Red Sea and got rid of the Egyptians, they were not free. Proof to it is the Egyptians came chasing them. So the Maharal of Prague takes this thought process a step further. That as long as the Jews didn't physically enter the land of Israel, which was the ultimate stage of their redemption, they were still not 100% considered redeemed yet. Although there were stages in the redemption, although there was prep for the redemption, although they physically didn't have to slave any longer, but these were all prep stages for the ultimate redemption, which was the entry into the land of Israel, which happened on the 41st year. And the Maharal writes that just like then, the reign of Moses had to take place 40 years, and on the 41st year, the Jews were ready for the final redemption, so too does he say that yes, there is a Mashiach around always. After all, we just now completed to say that from the moment of the destruction of the temple, the Mashiach was already born. He says that when the time of Mashiach will come, there will also be a similarity there. He will first reign in leadership for 40 years. And on the 41st year of his reign of leadership will come his revelation. And he writes something very interesting, that if the case is that he's been around for 40 years and he was prepping the world, why didn't it happen in the 40 years? And he says that as far as Mashiach was concerned, he was ready during the 40 years too. There's a step missing. The recipients of the rays of light, of the effect of the influence of this Mashiach, the recipients of his influence, have to desire his coming. It has to be a call from below rather than an enforcement from above. In other words, Mashiach does not appear forced upon the Jewish people by the Almighty or by Mashiach, but the Jewish people have to, so to speak, seek and try to find this individual and try to ask and beg and plead for the liberation to take place and for the revelation of Mashiach to appear. And at that 41st year, it will happen, and then Mashiach will reveal himself. This is something, again, written in a book many, many hundreds of years ago. Applying all this to us today, let's analyze what is Mashiach, who is Mashiach, is this a real concept? Although I mentioned before that it is so true that for all these years the average Jew knew that one of the 13 principles of faith is the belief in a Mashiach, and many people said this every day in the Siddur, but realistically speaking, this was a nice fantasy. As a matter of fact, I remember in the early 50s, when people heard someone in the street speaking about Mashiach, they said, this guy's a Chabadnik. The world didn't buy the story in real terms, but if somebody's talking that language, it's got to be a Chabadnik. Because the only people that have always spoken, not in fantasy terms, not in wishful thinking terms, but in reality about Mashiach, was a Lubavitcher, a Chabadnik. So those years, when you stood at a bus station, two boys of Lubavitcher Yeshiva, and they were talking among themselves, and the word Mashiach came up, and a third guy may have been a very religious Jew standing next to them, and he heard these guys talking about Mashiach, said, these guys must be Chabadniks, because who else talked about it? You didn't hear anywhere in the world, even in the most religious segments of the community, the talks of Mashiach. Now, yes, there were words about the prep for the Messiah's arrival. As a matter of fact, in 1948, when the Israelis proclaimed the state of Israel as a country, there were many people who used the term that this is Ashal to the Geula, this is the beginning of the redemption of the Jewish people. However, the Rebbe refuted this very vehemently on many, many occasions, because the Rebbe suggested that Mashiach can only reveal himself and come when the world is ready for it. And although this may have been an act of God for the sake of preparing the world, but to call this part of the messianic redemption is not correct, because the messianic redemption has got to be done strictly through Mashiach. Interestingly enough is that the Rebbe in his 40 years of leadership has been pounding away time and time again about the concept of Mashiach. To go back even a few generations, there are such things referred to as a ketz. A ketz means in Hebrew a designated date that we learn out from the Talmud or from the Medrash or from where other holy books we have, that this is the day Mashiach is going to come. As a matter of fact, the concept, the ketz, goes as early as the time of Jacob. I'm talking about our patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If you take a look at the end of the book of Genesis, in the final portion that we read in the Torah Vayechi, it says that before Jacob was passing away from the world, Jacob called together his children. And he wanted to tell them, he wanted to tell them what's going to happen to them in the ends of time. But if you open up the Chumash and look another couple of verses down the road, you don't see him telling them anything that's going to happen in the future. All that you see him is giving them blessing. And Rashi comments immediately and says that Bikesh Yankov Legalish is Akates. Yaakov wanted to reveal the time of Mashiach's arrival. Because after all, we see that when God made the covenant with Abraham, he did tell him about tough times. But at the very same time said, however, at the end will come the final redemption, which we'll soon discuss in a second. But the point that I want to make is that when Yaakov wanted to gather his children in order to tell them what's going to happen in the end of times, Rashi concludes and says, Nistalko mimena shchina. His divine inspiration, his prophecy ability was removed from him. It wasn't the time yet to tell the children the final redemption date, and therefore, in order, so to speak, not to make a fool out of himself, after all, he called them all together, so he started blessing each and every one before his death. But his intentions were to tell them as Hakate, the date, the final date of redemption. Which is very interesting, by the way. I know we're shifting around from item to item, but I think I would like to cover this very comprehensively so that we have a full idea that this is not something that's being concocted today, but this is something that dates back even to the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God comes to Abraham and is making a covenant with him. We're becoming partners. If you take a look what took place at the covenant, God took an animal with Abraham, they split it in half, put a side here, a side there, and both walked through in the center, which in those days was a sign of unification. It was a sign of two people now closing a partnership. But a partnership not in the sense of two business people, which each one goes in his own little merry way all day long, and just during the office hours they come together and they're partners in business. This was the sign of a ultimate friendship, partnership, relationship that cannot change. You would assume when two people get together and want to become partners, they would only be talking and thinking about the good times. After all, when two people sit down at a table and start talking, we're going into business, they all talk about the millions of dollars they're going to make. They all talk about the good times they're going to have. They all talk about, wow, how are we going to take this little fledgling company and turn it into a massive, huge corporation nationally recognized. Nobody starts talking about the tough times. If you're going to talk about the bad times about bankruptcy, you're not going to be going into business together. But in God's covenant with Abraham, we find some very interesting phenomenon here. God tells Abraham, I want you to know that the land that you are on today is going to be yours forever. It's going to be transmitted to your children through Isaac forever and ever. Isaac, your child, is going to become a multitude of people, a nation amongst nations of the world that you will not be able to count his numbers. And he says, look at the heavens and look at the earth. And just like you cannot count the stars of the heaven, so will you not be able to count your children. And just like you cannot count the dust particles of the sand of the earth, you're not going to be able to count your children. Those are the words that God tells him. So this is a very positive statement. But in the same breath, God turns around and tells him, I want you to know that there will be tough times too. For 400 years, they're going to be slaves in a land that's foreign to them. They're not going to be their own people. However, I want you to know that at the end of that period of time, they will be freed, they will be liberated, and they will end up back in the Holy Land right over here. Because in between the sins, quote unquote, of those nations who are living here hasn't hit its peak yet, where they still have some merits on this land. Similar to what I told you a moment ago, what the Zohar says about the rights of the Bnei Yishmael, the children of Yishmael, the Arabs, to the land, it has to come to a point of diminishing return, if you will, where their merits on the land diminishes to the point that it vanishes completely, and then the right time of the coming of the righteous Mashiach will take place. So throughout the ages, we knew a concept called Kates. Kates, as I said a moment ago, the date of the arrival of the final Mashiach. It's interesting to note that during the time of the Tzemach Tzedek, which was the third leader of Chabad, there was one of these cases. There was one of these dates that was ready for the arrival of Mashiach. The date came and went, and Mashiach didn't come. The Hasidim came to the Tzemach Tzedek and said, "Rabbi, what's going on? There was a time for Mashiach to come. How come he didn't show up?" And the Tzemach Tzedek responded to them that there were some very important books of Hasidic philosophy, of esoterics of Torah that were printed in. God threw us a candy, if you will. The world was not really ready for it, but since it was a time for it to happen, God threw us a candy. Those are the words that Tzemach Tzedek said. In later years, we've had similar experiences. As a matter of fact, one of the dates listed in the books, heavily listed as a righteous, an auspicious moment for the revelation of Mashiach, was in 1948. And interestingly enough, is that people asked in 1948 the previous Rabbi, how come Mashiach hasn't shown up? And there too the response was, God threw us a candy. Gave us Israel. Threw us a candy. So it's like a child who is beginning to grow, who really becomes satisfied with a candy versus $1 million. Why? The answer is his mind is still not mature enough to appreciate that $1 million is worth more than a candy. So you can satisfy a child with a candy versus $1 million. If you would take a check of $1 million and write it to a 3-year-old, would he appreciate what you just gave him? No, he wouldn't know. He'd throw it away. Tim, it would be another toy. It would be a piece of paper to write on the back. So what do you do to a child like that? You give him a candy. Kid is satisfied. The kid is happy. You gave him everything he asked for. The world was not ready, as I said a moment ago, for the revelation of Mashiach. The kid, so to speak, was not mature enough. God gave us a candy. The creation of a Jewish state, although this was ours for many, many years. The Rebbe over the years has also suggested that in 1967 was also a ripe time for the arrival of Mashiach. Again, the Rebbe not suggesting this on his own, but rather taking this from holy books, that in 1967 there was also a case. And as a matter of fact, the Rebbe very strongly throughout that period of time spoke very, very emphatically that this was a ripe time for the revelation of Mashiach, but we missed the boat again. And this continuously kept on happening, and it similarly happened in 1983 and so on. So we see that throughout the ages and throughout the times, there have been various designated moments listed as kates, as an auspicious hour, an auspicious moment when Moshiach can reveal himself. But to go back to, as I said a moment ago, let's stop with all this for a second and let's find the designation as to who is Mashiach, what are his qualifications, is this somebody real or is this somebody in the world of fantasy, and let's decide, therefore, in our own generation and in our own day and age, is there such thing around, can there be a Mashiach, and can we really expect his arrival? The most emphatic source on Mashiach is the codifier, the Rambam, Maimonides. Maimonides is a halachic, acceptable codifier of Jewish law, And Maimonides describes everything from the beginning until the end in his book. As a matter of fact, in his introduction, Maimonides writes the following. His book he named Mishneh Torah. Mishneh Torah means the repetition of the Torah. Or if you will, let's find a better expression to it in modern terms. Let's call it the index to Torah. And Maimonides writes that if a person will open up a Chumash and learn the 5 books of Moses, and then will learn the Mishneh Torah, his book, the Rambam, he has actually completed the entire Torah study. And he writes that every Jew is obligated to study the whole Torah, but facing reality, not everybody is capable of doing so. You've got to be a great scholar to know all the Talmudic tractates and all the Medrashes and the Zohars and the esoterics of Torah. It's very hard. So Maimonides says, therefore, he set out for a new task to put together all the esoterics of Torah and everything that is brought down in all the Talmudic tractates into his book, namely the Mishneh Torah. And if a person will learn through the cycle of Mishneh Torah, it will be as if he had learned the entire Torah, perhaps not in depth, but something that is equal for the greatest of scholars and for the most simplest of children. That's what Maimonides writes in his introduction. And he put all the laws in there. And Maimonides, as I said before, is not just an author that some people liked and some people challenged, but he's an author that the entire Jewish community accepted as being one of the codifiers of Jewish law. At the conclusion of his writings, when he finally covered everything from world creation, so to speak, till the end of times, he concludes with what will take place in the times of the coming of Moshiach. And Maimonides writes the following, that Moshiach is a person that is going to be born to a mother and father of flesh and blood. It is not somebody that's going to be an angel. It's not somebody that's going to fly off the heavens. It's nothing more or less than a human being born to a mother and father of flesh and blood. And Maimonides continues to point out that how do we simple people know whether this is the real Mashiach or not? After all, throughout Jewish history, we have faced many false messiahs as well, as late as the Shapsi Tzvi movement within our own era, so to speak, in the last few generations. So how do we know who is the righteous Mashiach or not? Maimonides gives us a distinction of what would make up the righteous Mashiach, and he gives 10 designated items what you can look forward to. First of all, he says that Mashiach has got to be, as I said a moment ago, a human being, but he has to come from the household of David. Then he says that he is going to have to be he's going to have to be a great scholar, a Talmudic and Torah scholar like David, his father. Then he goes on to suggest that his impact in life is going to be more than just on himself. The sphere of his influence is going to be more than just for himself. He's going to impact the world around him. He will also battle, to use the expression of Maimonides, Yilchei Milchemes Hashem. He will battle the wars of the Almighty. What does that mean? It doesn't mean he's going to be a general, a 5-star general, a 4-star general. It doesn't mean that he has to walk around with an armored mechanized division or an air force or a land force, but it means that he will develop an armed forces that will be able to engulf the world with the influence and the impact of David, his father, of Torah and mitzvahs. It also means that there will be subject matters that the world is going to be facing during that period of time, popular or not. He will battle the wars of Torah and mitzvahs. And Maimonides comes to one more aspect, v'yanatzeach. Not only will he be the warrior of these battles, but he will succeed as well. And then he continues to go on to say that v'yikabetz nitchei Yisrael, he will gather the Jewish people and he'll bring them to Israel and he'll build the Beis Hamikdash and so on and so forth. And Maimonides concludes that if he meets the 10 qualifications, harei ze Moshiach vadai, then he is most definitely the righteous Mashiach, and you have to accept him and follow him, and this is it. However, say for a moment that he meets 9 out of the 10 qualifications, he uses the terminology harei ze becheskas Mashiach. He is more or less in the accepted version of being the potential Mashiach. Probably this is him. I gotta begin to look up to him because this guy meets the qualifications, but I will only begin to refer to him as Mashiach when he hits the 10th qualification. But if he meets 9, 7, 8, or whatever it may be in number closer to the 10, then he is already Becheskas Mashiach. I can already accept him as being the one in our generation who is going to be accepted as being the Mashiach. Then Maimonides goes on and says, what is going to happen when Mashiach comes? Will the world turn over? Will there be a world of bliss? Will we be facing a paradise? What's going to take place? And Maimonides uses the expression, Olam kiminhoge noiheg. The world will still continue to operate as it did before. Nothing is going to change. The only major transformation of the world during the time of the coming of Mashiach will be the fact that there will be no more wars. And he spells out the reason for that is because the onslaught of wars comes as a result of jealousies and differences of opinions. And he suggests, therefore, that one of the major things that will happen is that opinions will begin to form alike. There will be no more jealousies one with another. Therefore, there will be no more bickering between one and another. And as a result of that, there will be no more wars with one another. So past enemies will now live using the expression of the scriptures like the lamb and the sheep together, like the lion and the wolf will be able to live in peace and harmony, and the plowshares will be, the swords will be turned into plowshares, and so on and so forth. And he expresses what all that means, and he says in essence it means that we'll all be in the same thought process so that the world will no longer see wars. Peace and tranquility will reign in the world, and that the ultimate will be that the world will become filled with the knowledge of God, just like the bed of the ocean is filled with water. Nobody can dispute that the ocean bed is covered with water. So too, he says, in the time of Mashiach, nobody will dispute that the world is filled with the knowledge and the appearance and even the feelings of God. Godliness will be apparent in this world. Now comes something extremely interesting. Maimonides throws in a sentence, and he says that being that when Mashiach comes, not only Jews will be impacted by this, but the Gentiles as well. Therefore, the Gentile world will also have to be prepared for the concept of Mashiach, for the arrival of this righteous Mashiach. And Maimonides comes literally with a bombshell. And he makes a statement as follows: that the reason God allowed some 2,000 years ago that the world should accept a concept of a Messiah with the birth and death of what we know Yeshu HaNotzri, or what the world refers to as Jesus, is not because they all of a sudden saw someone new that brought revelation and redemption to the world, because after all, the world was not redeemed or salved. There was no salvation at that period of time. But Maimonides says that the only reason that this was allowed to happen in the world, in the Gentile segment of society, was in order for the Gentile world to be prepared with a concept of Mashiach. Being that the big day of the revelation of the real Mashiach, the righteous Mashiach, was supposed to come, and that not only the Jews were supposed to be impacted by this, but even the Gentiles as well, there would be no way that the Gentile would be able to accept a righteous Mashiach without a preparation for it. So God made something to happen in the world by divine providence, which would lead even the Gentile world to understand that there is such concept of salvation, there is such concept of a Mashiach, and therefore when the real Mashiach comes, they too will recognize it as such. Which in essence means, if we study this Rambam as it says, that as we draw closer to the real coming of Mashiach, even the Gentiles will begin gradually to recognize that the whole Jesus business that they have accepted as a God is not really true. They will begin to define him as whatever he was, but not as a Messiah. It's interesting to note that we're living in a time when the movement of what they refer to as the righteous Noahide Gentiles is beginning to burst out of its seams. These are Gentiles who now say that although they were Christians for many years, are dropping the belief in Jesus as being a God or the Son of God. They may be looking at him as some kind of a prophet or whatever else it may be, but in the same breath are saying that there were many Jews and many sages and scholars who were in the same situation and had the same heavy knowledge and expressions that the Gentile world believes about him, but he was nothing more. And they're beginning to say that we are Noahites, and there were Noahites before Judaism came into an organized form of lifestyle. And as a result of that, they want to continue to live by the 7 Noahite laws and all its ramifications and be better Gentiles. Which is interesting to note that if we look around us in the world, we see that the world is beginning to recognize something different in terms of preparation for the coming of the righteous Mashiach. Now, coming back to the Jewish community, we see also that in the last years of our own time, we see that the world is shifting. In many ways, as I began in the beginning, that there are people who never even dreamt of talking the word Mashiach, even in the Jewish community and even in the religious community, are now using the terms. It's acceptable in the street. You're not going to be looked upon as a Chabadnik or a Lubavitcher per se when you say the word Mashiach any longer. People now are speaking more about it. Why? Because it has entered the atmosphere that there is such concept of Mashiach, and there is such thing that it's real rather than fantasy, and it's going to happen. Now I stand to offer all of you a challenge. If we have come to the conclusion that Maimonides is the ultimate authority to tell us who is Mashiach, what is Mashiach, when will this Mashiach reveal himself, and what will take place after the days of Mashiach, I offer a challenge. That means to say that in today's day and age, there's got to be in this world somewhere a human being that meets at least some of those qualifications, that has the potentiality of being the righteous Mashiach. Which means that if I say in the Siddur today, Ani mamin be'emunah shalema bevias HaMoshiach, I believe wholeheartedly in the coming of Mashiach, and that I look forward every day for his coming. Say that Mashiach has to reveal himself today, And being that we just came to the conclusion that it's got to be a person that is a human being born to a mother and father of flesh and blood, who today in the world meets any qualifications whatsoever that you can label as being the potential Moshiach. I may be a little bit biased here,